thank you for joining us on She's with the Band. In this episode, part 1 of Sue's United States adventure. Sue explains how she escaped to Los Angeles to further her career, lived in the luxurious Beverly Hills area, and met Hollywood legends.
She's with the band. She's with the band.
This podcast is brought to you by Dover Street Productions and may contain some content that some listeners might find offensive. Let's begin. So, there seems to be a pattern here where you sort of walk in almost blindly in the best way possible and in an incredibly remarkable way into these different situations in different cities and different countries. After Marrakesh, what happened next?
Yes, so I came back in the end of May 71. My sister got married in June. And then I went to work for Frere and Slim Miller. It was called Slim Miller Entertainments. I have no idea how I met them, although I do have a vague feeling because I was very good friends with Joanne Newfield, who was Brian Epstein's PA. And I guess it was because I was friendly with Joanne, and she was going out with Colin Peterson, who was the drummer with the Bee Gees. He was the only member that wasn't a brother. He was the drummer. And incidentally, she married him, and I believe she's still married to him to this day. They moved to Australia, where he was from. But I was very friendly with Joanne. They lived in this mews in Bayswater, and Slim and Frere Miller lived next door. And I suppose that's how I must have met them. Slim had been a comic in his day, and he was very funny. And Frere had a great sense of humour. And they had set up an artist agency, and they asked me to go and work for them as an agent, and they had the New Seekers at the time. So they must have been going for a little while, I guess. So the New Seekers were getting very successful at the time, and they were managed by a guy called David Joseph, an Australian. And they had these offices in St. James's Street, big suite of office. So David had his office there. Slim and Frere had their offices there. And then there was a sort of a communal office for staff of either company. But David had his own interests. And then Lawrence Myers, who's this great guy, he became a really good friend of mine, Lawrence. He was in the music business, and he eventually became a film producer, but he was heavily involved with Bowie, all to do with publishing rights, the Stones, a lot of people. He was great, Lawrence. In fact, I'm still friendly with him to this day. And I went to work there, and then I had my own little niche because I had started supplying artists to advertising agencies for product endorsement. So a lot of people came to me. Annie Nightingale came over to me, and there was this gorgeous guy called Ben Thomas. He was an American actor. He was the fiancé of Susie George. Susan George was a very well-known actress, and he was gorgeous. I had him on my books, and I had Lyndall Hobbs, who at the time I think was going out with Michael White, who was a producer, and then she was with Al Pacino, as it so happens, years later. But I had her. She had very modelly looks. She was Australian, but she wasn't a model. I think she was in television. So I had some good people that they were always wanted for TV commercials. And then there was the New Seekers, and Frere had booked the artists for these big clubs, these variety. They weren't working men's clubs. They were superior to working men's clubs. They were variety clubs. Batley was very famous, and she didn't have Batley, but Batley was the big one at the time. Frere had the Fiestas in Sheffield and Stockton-on-Tees, Talk of the South, which was in Southend, things like that. Anyway, one day, the New Seekers were appearing up in Manchester. They were It's what was called doubling in those days. You did 2 venues a night. It's like the early show and the late show in Vegas, but except it wasn't Vegas. This was Manchester. And I'll never forget this as long as I live. They were doubling at the Garrick Theatre Club, Lee, which Lee is on the outskirts of Manchester, with the Bolton and Wigan casinos. Bolton and Wigan casinos were a bit rough. And so Frere had the cushy job because we had a percentage of the take on the door. That was what the deal was. So you had to keep your eye on things. So Frere plonked herself at the Garrick Theatre Club, Lee, every night. And then we'd rented a car. So I took the car. Considering I have no sense of direction now, how I ever found myself to the Bolton and Wigan casino every night. Well, they alternated. Garrick Theatre Club, the 7 nights. Then half the week was at the Bolton casino and the other half was at the Wigan casino. Boy, was it rough there. And I did get lost finding it initially. And I'd wind down my window and I'd go, there were country roads. I'd go, excuse me, could you tell me? Oh, you go to Bottom Road and you turn left at Brew, then third right at Brew. Everything was at Brew, which was the pub. That's how they gave you directions. We were staying at the Queen's Hotel in Manchester, which was in Queen's Square. And they used to do Top of the Pops there every week before it came down to London. So we'd arrive home late. Then I'd pick Frere up on the way back to the Garrick Theatre Club, and we were starving. And it was after midnight, and I said, where are we going to get something to eat? So we walked round Queen Square, and there was a Golden Egg. Oh, it was a pretty naff place, the Golden Egg. And there were people inside. It was gone midnight, but there were people inside. So I said, well, this is all that's on offer. This is it. And the door was locked. I'm banging on the door and they wouldn't let us in. I keep banging and banging and sort of called them over, and she said, no, I'm really sorry. She said, we don't let in people of your sort after midnight. They thought we were on the game. Yes, but it's the first time I've been mistaken for a hooker, I have to say. So I probably stayed there for at least a couple of years.
After cracking the UK music industry, did you ever feel compelled to go to the US?
It's not worth writing home about, but I did go to LA for 6 months. Well, I went out to stay because David Joseph, who managed the New Seekers, he and Robin, his wife, and children had moved out there because David wanted to break the New Seekers in the States. He had other bands, well, and they had rented a house at Malibu. So I'd never been to the States before. And so I went to stay with them for 2 weeks. And when I was there, it was Labor Day weekend. I had no idea at the time during this 2-week stay that Labor Day was such a big deal. There was a surprise birthday party that they threw for David in the office when I was there. And I met this guy who was involved with David. He was in the music business. He was a record company man. His name was Stan Noress. And he worked for Mike Curb's record company. Mike Curb everyone knows who Mike Curb was. He was an incredibly successful record producer. He was a very straight guy, though. I have a feeling Mike Curb was a Mormon. I thought at one point he was married to Karen Carpenter, but I think I'm wrong there. Maybe he went out with. But Stan fell for me in a big way, and he was really fun. He was really nice, and he came to London and we went out. But whilst I was there, this Labor Day weekend, the New Seekers were in Vegas. They were at the Riviera Hotel supporting Vicky Carr, and Presley was on. I thought, oh God, I'd love to see Presley. I said, I'll come down for Labor Day. So all the New Seekers, they all had these massive rooms. So Eve said, well, come and share my room. It's massive. So I said, okay. So the idea was to go down for a few days. So this other band that David managed, this Australian band, also were down there. And so we all went to see Presley. And he did an extra show. They always did 2 shows a night in Vegas, always. But such was the demand that he did one at 3:00 in the morning, an extra, and that was the only time we could get tickets. So we went, and I have to say, the voice was still there then, and it was before he was bloated. So this would have been 1973. But he obviously decided this was going to be a big drag to do this show at 3:00 in the morning. And he forgot the words. He'd have all these little innuendos with the band and all these hardcore fans out there that were just screaming. They paid, it was a lot of money, $12 then for a ticket. It was a lot of money. And I thought he was very unprofessional, actually. Very unprofessional. But as I said, the voice was still there. And I went back to LA. That's the only time. So if anybody ever tells me about they're going to Vegas, I say, just don't go. I know it's changed a lot and it's got a lot younger. And then, so I decided I was going to try living there. So I went out in 74 and Stan was very excited about me going. So I stayed with David and Robin for 2 weeks because by then they were living out there and they bought this house on Bedford Drive in Beverly Hills on the flats. And Stan lived in this sweet little road off Wilshire behind Neiman Marcus. And so I moved in with Stan, and because I didn't have my own car, so I used to drive Stan's car, which was this Mercedes. But then he changed it for this Cadillac, a seriously big car. And Stan was going on this trip, business trip, for 2 or 3 days. And he left me all these instructions. Anyway, on the day that I was driving the car down La Cienega to take it to the garage to have the sunroof fitted, there was this lunatic driving, crossing the lanes in a Rent-A-Wreck. Really, I mean, it was seriously, he must have got this from Rent-A-Wreck. You've never seen anything so bashed up in the whole of your life. And the guy pranged the car, and it was scraped all along. There's nothing I can do. I mean, on La Cienega, which is a very big and busy street with several lanes on it. So I arrive at the garage where it's being done, and I said, "Can you help me?" I said, my boyfriend is going to kill me when he's here. He'd only just taken delivery of it about 3 or 4 weeks before. I was in a hot sweat, and they said, "No, don't worry, don't worry." They weren't a body shop, but they managed to do it. I mean, then one of the fish died. I thought, oh Christ! And then something happened with the back door as well. It comes in threes. The 3 things it asked me to do. There was something, I don't know, that when the locksmith came, I can't remember what happened. Anyway, I was dreading telling him about the car and the fish. And so he was coming back on a Sunday night, and Sunday night was a big night on television. It was Mission Impossible, right? All the guys were really big on Mission Impossible. And I decided there was only one thing for this. I thought, I'll get myself a bit tipsy. So I got out a bottle of his best wine and I started drinking that. And I don't know if I smoked anything or not. I can't remember. Half of something, I have no idea, but I drank a lot of wine. I thought this is the only way to do it. And then I thought, I'll make myself look as alluring as possible when I tell him. And I had this bit see-through caftan that I used to wear as a cover-up over a bikini for around the pool, left over from my Marrakesh days. And so there I was when he arrived home on the bed and seriously tipsy, very tipsy. And he comes in. hello, television goes on for Mission Impossible. And I kept trying to say, Stan, I've got something to tell you. He said, not now. I think he thought I was going to jump him, you know. I kept saying, Stan. He went, not now, later. Like that. And then in the end, I thought it's now or never. So I jumped up on the bed. I took off my kaftan. So there I was. So he said, what are you, that's when he said, not now, Sue, later. That's when he said it. I went, well, you can't hit a woman when she hasn't got any clothes on. And I told him and he fell about. He did. He dined out on that story for a long time. So then Stan and I parted company halfway through. I can't remember. He was just the loveliest guy. But I think we remained friends. Yes, because he used to come to London and I used to have dinner with him. And then I rented an apartment in West Hollywood. Oh, I tell you who I did go out with, who asked me out for dinner then. I met him at a party, was the Fonz, Henry Winkler. I just split up with Stan. That was it. I just split up with Stan. And we met at a party and he said, will you have dinner with me one night? So he took my number and we went out for dinner and he took me to Ma Maison, which was the restaurant at the time. And we had a really nice evening. He said, do you want to drive down to the beach? So I said, sure. So we drove down to the beach and I think I got a bit maudlin because I'd had quite a bit to drink. And I think I was talking about Stan a bit too much because we just split up, which is not ideal on a date, especially with the Fonz. But he was really nice. So I had an okay time, but it wasn't working out for me work-wise, really. And I worked in this building. It was a big building on Sunset. And all the producers and people had their offices there. Mervyn LeRoy, who was a very famous producer. Well, no, Mervyn was a director. The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz. He was down the corridor and he loved me. And he used to always come and talk to me. And he loved everything English. And he used to tell me wonderful stories. I remember him. He was just, yes, he was the director of lots of major films. Well, you couldn't get more major than The Wizard of Oz, really, could you? So it just lasted 6 months. And I said I'd be back for the September anyway, because my cousin was getting married in London. And I said I'd be back for his wedding. And then I went back home. And I worked for MAM, who were the biggest artist agency there was in London. Something and artist management. I've forgotten now. Oh, they had everybody. Tom Jones, Engelbert Humperdinck, Harold Davison, who was the director of the agency. He had Frank Sinatra. So it was, they had a lot of big artists. So I worked there for 6 months. I shared an office with a lovely guy called Alan Field, who was an agent. But I had the Talk of the South. I had the bookings of Talk of the South. I put all the artists in. And I had Talk of the West as well in Cornwall. So that was my own thing. They didn't pay me, but they gave me the office space. And I was allowed to do my own thing. I don't know where they benefited by having me there. And then I opened my own agency, which I had from 1975 to 81 till I went for the big time in LA when I was there for 8 years. And so my agency was that I still continued with the advertising side of it, where they want big names to endorse product. And then I had my little band of artists like Annie and Ben and everybody. And I had the clubs. I still had the 2 clubs, Talk of the South and Talk of the West. And you had to have a license. You had to, it was like when in journalism, you had to be a member of NUJ, have your card. And I had my agency license. And I did these series of commercials. It was for Blue Band Margarine. The 4 people that I represented for that was Joan Collins. She got a really big fee at the time for that time of year. Her agent, Dennis Selinger, CMA, big time. Dennis wouldn't split commission with me, so I called her father, who was an agent, Joe Collins, because I used to do business with Joe Collins for the clubs. And I said, Dennis Selinger won't split commission. Leave it with me, darling. So I represented Joan. She was very pleased about that because it was a lot of money then. And Jilly Cooper, Ozzie Clark, and Alice Pollock. Alice was his partner, Ozzie, and they had their shop was in Chelsea, in Radnor Walk. I mean, Ozzie was hot then, as a dress designer. Oh, and the other one was Gerald Durrell, funnily enough. Gerald Durrell. I mean, he lived in Corfu, didn't he? Because they just did that TV series with Keely Hawes. She was Mrs. Durrell, yes. And then a lot of footballers when they wanted them to endorse, a lot of Arsenal players. Bobby Charlton, Jackie Charlton, people like that. And then also, the Edinburgh Playhouse became a client of mine, and I booked some big acts into there. And then I did Clyde Festival in Glasgow, obviously, as it was the Clyde. The Clyde Festival. I booked Neil Sedaka into whatever the venue was in Glasgow. I remember going up there with Barry Dickens. Glasgow was still very rough then. And basically, I had offices in Little Newport Street, which was behind where it's called the Hippodrome now. It was the talk of the town, where all major artists used to appear in those days, major artists. And then I decided one day that it was just same old, same old. I wasn't really doing anything new, and it just became routine. And I thought, I'm going to go off to LA. Now then, I didn't know anybody in LA except a great friend of mine from London. He produced TV commercials. He was also going out to LA. He decided he was going to go out to LA. And we went out at a very similar time. I mean, it wasn't why I went. It was just a coincidence. And thank God for Bryn, because he was my best friend out there. Bryn was just wonderful. And his boyfriend Simon then came out. So we were all great friends. And all my friends there, really, my great friends were English. Anyway, I had, because David Putnam was a friend of mine in London. And I told David that, because by now he'd moved into films. Because when I first knew David, he was a photographer's agent. He had all the greatest photographers. And then he went into film. He hadn't done Chariots of Fire then. It came a few years later, I think. So I said to David that I wanted to go to LA. Could he give me some introductions? Or, I'll just write to people. He said, I wouldn't write to them because they're not going to read your letter. So I said, oh, well, just give me some names and I'll go and see them. He said, oh, you won't. So David had got in touch with somebody called Sue Lesser, an English person out there that worked for Columbia, who became a really good friend of mine. But I didn't know Sue Lesser at the time. She was sort of the stop for anybody English coming out to LA, because she was one of the first to go out there. And so I went out there, and I'd given myself 6 months. I'd taken enough money for 6 months to last. So that would take me to the end of the year. And what happened was, I met a lot of really good people. And I'd only gone out there in July. This is when I rented Martin Samuel's house. He was a hairdresser in London. When I was really young, he was the junior in the salon where my mother went to. And he used to practice on my hair. They used to have practice nights in those days. So I knew him since I was about 11 years old. And then then we lost touch, but he did hair for TV commercials in London. He was incredibly successful. He moved to LA. He and Mary, his wife, moved to LA, and he really became very successful, not just commercials, but film and everything. And they'd rent their house to me because they didn't want to sell it. And we swapped cars. He had my Mini in London, and I had his VW Bug convertible. It was in like a limey, yellowy colour. I'd gone out there with a couple of names, 2 or 3 names, and basically that's how it all started. Not long after I got there, it was the royal wedding, Diana and Charles's royal wedding. So I threw the Brit party. It's the day of the wedding. I started to have a really nice time there, and I was introduced to this woman. Well, she was probably a similar age to me, Anne. Her name was Anne Barish, and her husband was Keith Barish, who had been in property big time, but he was now in LA in the movie business because he had all this money and wanted to be in the movie business. And she wanted me to meet him, even though she was in New York. She wasn't living in LA. She had a son. So I met Keith, and he offered me a job as his PA. And it was a very strange situation. I was there for probably, because I left after 6 months because I didn't get on with his, I guess he was his partner. He was the guy that was in the film business. Keith wasn't. He was the one that had all the money. And we had these very nice offices next to, as I said, on Melrose, next to Ma Maison. So we'd just get whatever we wanted from Ma Maison, really. He used to keep me behind because he couldn't bear to be on his own, Keith, if he was having a dinner meeting. And so I didn't have much of a life, and I used to have to wait there with him. He always used to say, I'm the only one that could make his vodka tonics to perfection. And then the only nice thing he ever said to me was, I don't know what you're doing out here. He was East Coast, so he hated LA, really. And he said, I don't know what you're doing here. He said, you've got more class in your little finger than all these people put together. He loved London. In fact, he had a house in Chelsea. And all the people that I had to deal with, all the directors and writers, a lot of them were English because they were all the TV commercials directors, like the Ridley Scotts, the Brian Gibsons, Adrian Lyne. All these people were the big up-and-coming directors. And I used to he had me scouting for properties that they could option to turn into film. So I came back from London on this one trip. I'd just seen in the theatre, I'd seen The Dresser with Tom Courtenay and Albert Finney. And then I'd seen with Julie Walters Educating Rita on the stage. I thought, educating. It wasn't with Michael Caine and I thought, well, these two would be perfect for film. And I remember going into every story meeting, and I'd act out the Julie Walters part. When she falls in her first meeting with him, when she's trying to get into his office and he doesn't answer her, and then she practically falls into the room. She pushes it, falls in. So I'm acting this whole thing out. I mean, I'm doing it week after week, and they're saying, well, who do you see in this part? And the studios only went for big people in those days. And I said, I see Goldie Hawn in this. I think she'd be really good. And I'd called William Morris in London, because it was Willie Russell wrote the play. So they must have had Willie Russell. So I called to see if the film rights were available, and they were. And hallelujah, one day after all this acting out the Julie Walters part, they said go. So I called William Morris, and wouldn't you know, within the 2 weeks since I'd spoken to them, Lewis Gilbert, who was the director, weeks, I'd fall in that bloody door doing that opening scene. So that went by the wayside, and they passed on The Dresser, which was again made into a film as well. And I would read all these scripts that came through, and because that was my job. But I met a lot of really nice people, some of the directors, some of the theatre people in New York who Keith had known for ages, and they only wanted to speak to me. They wouldn't want to speak to anybody else. And they all became my little friends, or I became their little friends. People like Billy Friedkin and lots of directors. Then I left Keith. I went off in high dudgeon. And because I knew all the people that they used to have meetings with them, I knew them from London. That's how I think I got friendly with Michael Apted as well, I think. Michael became a really good friend of mine. So I went off to London and the phone didn't stop ringing. Keith, come back. This one only wants to speak to you. That one only wants to speak to you. Ted Kocher, Billy Friedkin, Bobby Fryer, who was a big producer, lovely man, big producer in New York. They only want to talk to you. They don't want to talk to anybody else. Please come back. I'll make you vice president. You can stay at the house at Malibu. So I thought, okay. I went back, and I should never have gone back because Keith was a very complex person. He led a double life, really. He had a private phone line in his office that, under threat of death, you were not allowed to pick it up. If it rang, you were not allowed to pick it up. He wasn't at the office an awful lot. He had the most divine, I digress, he had the most divine chauffeur. He had a Rolls-Royce key. He was so nice. And sometimes throw me the keys to this Rolls-Royce. He said, oh, can you fill her up with petrol? I'd be petrified. But I remember once at the very beginning, I'd forgotten about the not picking the phone up. And the phone rang and I walked into his office and I picked it up. And I realized too late, I wasn't meant to have picked the phone up. This was the really, really private line. I said, hello. And the guy said, I knew who it was on the other end. And I said, I'm really sorry. I've got to put this phone down. I'm not meant to pick this up. I'm going to be in really big trouble. He said, don't worry. Your secret's safe with me. It was very difficult working for Keith, really. And he had the most terrible temper. But I wasn't scared of him. All the others were. They'd be shaking in their shoes when he'd come into the office. They didn't know what they were going to get. But I gave back as good as I got, you see.
In the next episode of Shoes with the Band, part 2 of Sue's adventures in the United States. Sue discusses the treacherous insecurity of the society in Los Angeles, as well as hilarious stories playing Trivial Pursuit with Eric Clapton, and a wet and wild New Year's Eve party with famous band The Who.
She's with the band.